Okay, good. Welcome everyone to the NENA Housing Week Forum. We are co-hosting it with Co-Housing Australia, which is the organisation that I'm part of. It's a week-long event with sessions on, we started last night and we have sessions running each lunchtime and evening until Friday lunchtime. So hope you can check out the program and come along to as many things as possible. Today we're talking specifically about homelessness and the crisis of finding affordable accommodation and dealing with all of the elements in between, from transition housing through to just a greater increase in affordable housing stock overall. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose land we meet. I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the climate and biodiversity emergency, and that if we don't get our heads around those unfolding issues, then we will be in a more and more dire situation down the track, and housing will be one of the least of our issues, but will also obviously be central in helping us deal with those outcomes in the future. So our first speaker today is Kate Breen. She's an affordable housing specialist and works as a consultant advising on policy planning and development of affordable housing. So before we go too far astray, I'll hand it over to her.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's make that larger. Can I get a thumbs up that you can see that? Great, thank you. So yeah, hi, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the lands in which I am sitting, which is also the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung lands, people of the Kulin Nation, not too far from Elena. So I've taken the focus today of this session of finding solutions to specifically look at local government mechanisms to increase social and affordable housing supply, and then in turn address homelessness. Because I guess, you know, the implied clearly in that term homelessness is the lack of home or the lack of affordable housing. So I've taken perhaps a different approach to maybe what you're expecting than some of the other speakers, but I hope it's a really useful insight into one of the ways that we might be able to increase supply of affordable housing and also specialised housing responses to people that maybe require other support. So I'm specifically going to talk in, I think I've got around 10 or so minutes, the role of local government, elements to deliver affordable housing, planning system approaches to facilitating outcomes, and also looking briefly at how councils might use their land, and finishing with some of the challenges related to these two areas. When we think about the role of your local council or local government, clearly they have roles to advocate, you know, I guess from that grassroots level up to higher levels of government. They clearly have roles around essential services, you know, collect our rubbish, provide library services, etc. So they clearly also have a role there around social planners, and that's quite a broad scope, and they manage particular community services. One of the core roles of local government is as a planning authority. They establish the local planning framework to you know, really direct how land will be used in the local area, but they need to do that in accordance with a broader state government framework and legislation. And then they are obviously the administrators of that. So when a developer wants to build something, it's local council that they typically are seeking approval from. Unless, you know, there's certainly areas in state policy where it might be the state government. They are also owners of assets and managers of those assets. And if we think about what some of those are, clearly different community facilities, maternal child health, libraries, recreational spaces, car parks being often a large component of council ownership, and roads. So that's just briefly a little bit of context about local government to hopefully help with the discussion. Just also this term affordable housing, I think it's often useful to just touch on, and particularly because you'll hear that I will say affordable housing, and what I'm talking about is really a whole range of housing responses, and that includes social housing or public and community not-for-profit led housing. And really a range of program responses that are both appropriate and also specifically allocated and affordable for households from, you know, very low income households, perhaps people with no income, up to potentially moderate income households that might require support. And so this diagram just shows an attempt to break down into some different key categories of types of affordable housing sitting within a broader housing spectrum, you know, all the way through to some new forms of affordable purchase and then obviously market housing. So when we think about, well, what do we actually need to get more affordable housing built? This little diagram really reflects that there's a whole lot of elements that go into residential construction, just generally, you know, land planning, construction, but also elements around the delivery of affordable housing. And the really critical ones, probably should be a very big bubble, is around the funding or the subsidy. But we also need to think about if you need specialised tenancy management, whether you need links to other wraparound supports. And given that subsidy component, we also need to think about how it's regulated to make sure that we're getting, as taxpayers, we're getting value, you know, government's getting value and that it's going to the right places. So the two that I'm going to specifically talk about today is around the use of land and the use of the planning system. And we think about the planning system in relation to facilitating affordable housing. I guess there's two ways you can look at it. It can either enable or constrain housing supply, housing diversity and affordability. Trying to simplify it a little bit here, but I think it's clear there's kind of two different and often polarising views on what the role land use planning should play generally. There's what you might class the neoliberal type of view, you know, it should be minimal intervention, it's a barrier, adds costs, the market should be free to do, you know, what the market does best, and what some might call a natural right to planning approvals. And then you know, again, kind of trying to put some labels on this, so perhaps what you might call a social democratic view, that planning is really there should be about benefiting the community, that we need to set boundaries to ensure there's balanced outcomes, you know, counter to that free market view, and that your ability to develop is not actually a right. I think the other critical thing around the planning system is important to recognise that increasing housing supply or building some more diverse, which often means smaller dwellings in the Australian housing market context, does not actually necessarily equal affordability. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that shows that it doesn't. So when you know, I talk to local councils and think, okay, well, what are the ways that the planning system could be used and therefore, you know, administered by councils to increase affordable housing? There's a few different mechanisms. Depends obviously on whether the state allows them to apply, but just at a high level, we've got things like a development contribution, which is like a mandatory cash or floor space, and might be similar to how certainly in Victoria, public open spaces contributions are made. You'll often hear the terms inclusionary zoning. I've separated that from development contributions, and one way to think about it is where there's a mandatory requirement, and it really, inclusionary zoning meaning it applies in specific circumstances. So it might be rezonings, it might be a particular area geographically, and again, it also normally is around the provision of floor space or dwellings, potentially cash. Voluntary planning incentives, and so these are basically options within a planning framework, again might be locational specific, that allow a developer to elect to take up an incentive, typically additional floor area or a density bonus, in exchange for giving something, you know, a public good such as affordable housing. And then site-specific agreements in Victoria, certainly, and New South Wales, these are called voluntary, and that's where the landowner and the council or the responsible authority agree to provide affordable housing as a result of the planning, and it may be linked to an incentive around or supporting their case for a particular yield. And then we also have some very specialised provisions, and I'll go to the next slide to talk about those. So some of those specialised provisions include, in Victoria recently, we've had two new planning clauses which are specific around the development of social or affordable housing by government, or a housing provider. And that's really saying that social housing has specific requirements and standards that are set, but also it reduces some of the more, some of the other planning requirements that a typical development might have to achieve to help with the fast tracking and delivery. And one of the critical parts of that is it's making a minister a decision maker instead of a local council if it achieves certain hurdles, and also takes away third-party appeals, which is where someone who's not the applicant, after a decision's been made, can take it to an administrative tribunal and attempt to have that decision overturned. We also have in New South Wales and Victoria, certainly, and perhaps in other jurisdictions, you have to apologies for my slightly Victorian-centric perspective today, but things around, say, boarding houses and rooming houses where there's standards, and also things that developers can get, like reduced car parking or increased height if they're delivering this type of housing, and also often clauses around forms like crisis accommodation or community care, which is more in the kind of NDIS space. So just touching again on those other types of requirements, mandatory requirements and inclusionary zones. Whilst this is often a topic that's raised a lot, it's actually, in my research, fairly limited that there is an outright development contribution for affordable housing. Typically, in most places, there is some offsetting by other incentives, such as you get increased height, and or there is other investment that governments are providing to help then with the costs of that housing being delivered. Certainly in the City of Sydney, there is a developer levy or an affordable housing levy, and that's quite a rare thing. It's been in place for a really long time, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but it is unusual in the Australian context and actually even globally. And really, inclusionary zones are much more a site-by-site or council-by-council type approach. So the developer levy in Ultimo-Pyrmont, and actually I believe it's now been extended to City of Sydney, comes under a Planning Act section, and basically sets not just an expectation, a requirement of a developer to provide a certain amount of their floor space towards an affordable housing purpose. But it also allows them to essentially pay that out in cash, and there's rates. So it's very clear for the developers wanting to go into this market what they would need to provide. The money goes into a fund which goes then to a housing agency, City West Housing, which was co-established by the state government there, to then buy land, use government land, or even acquire dwellings. And over around 25, 26 years, they've achieved around 900 dwellings. Critically, not just through that government, that developer contribution, but through effectively pooling contributions. In South Australia, they have what I kind of class more as an inclusionary zoning approach. They have an objective, 15% of significant developments of government land need to be affordable housing. They allow, under their planning controls, certain increases in yield or height, reduction in dwelling lot sizes, reduced car parking. And they also allow in that 15% that can be both affordable purchase or rental. And there's a little ad there on the side. They have a website where developers can advertise their product as long as it falls within a certain price point and is sold to people that earn below particular incomes. They basically have a first right to buy, and it's secured through a land management agreement with government. A study up till 2015 showed, and this came in over 2005 to 15, over a 10-year period, around 17% of dwellings were in major developments were committed into this, but the majority were certainly on former government land, so when government sells or other investment. Another one that I've mentioned is the floor area. This slide just talks about an approach in the city of Melbourne, and effectively, again, there's a really clear formula where if you want to build above a certain height, then you need to give something back in terms of a value share. There's a method, and you can translate the dollar amount or the value that you'd have to provide into floor space or dwellings to a housing agency. Voluntary agreements is really where the two parties, a council, seeks to negotiate with the landowner. It kind of draws on a lot of different concepts here and can, as I said, be offset by other yield and planning dispensations. It's certainly increasingly used by Melbourne councils. And I guess, you know, earlier on I put voluntary in inverted commas, because it's probably starting to look a lot more mandatory depending on which council you try and work in if you're a developer. An example here is a 3,000 unit redevelopment, industrial land. The developers agreed to support 5% of those dwellings, or around 150 units, being affordable housing. And they're going to do that by providing the land that will accommodate 150 units. And then the housing agency, a not-for-profit organisation, will go and get the funds to construct those units. There's a kind of default if the developer can't find an agency to get the money to build on that land. So the second part I just wanted to touch on, and apologies, I haven't looked at the time. Hopefully I've still got a few more minutes. Please jump in, Elena, if I'm going too long. But basically the use of council land, it's, you know, councils aren't necessarily flush with land, but it's certainly an opportunity that many councils are exploring. And it could also be the air rights above the land. And so they could provide that in a number of ways. They could gift that land, they could put it under a long-term lease, they could put it in a trust or a special purpose vehicle, for instance. This is an example of literally 100 metres from where I am right now in Footscray. There's a council car park. The building at the back here is a two-storey library, and you can kind of see in the back right corner there the types of developments that are occurring. This is a major activity centre, 6-7 k's from Melbourne CBD. So we've got these really well-placed opportunities that are currently used. Actually, until very recently, you didn't even pay for the car parking here. So is this really maximising this community asset, I guess is a good question I think councils should be asking. City of Port Phillip, some of you may be familiar, has really been the leaders in this space, where they've taken a lot of council assets and granted leases or placed the asset into a trust, which is managed by a housing agency. This is an example of a boarding house where they took this car park in the bottom left there and redeveloped the air rights. So the council gets their car park back, but we also get quality, albeit smaller, but quality new forms of housing for vulnerable people. Another example in the city of Darebin, again in Victoria, they're going to take a 42 car space spot right next to their library, and they're leasing that to a housing agency. The agency is currently proposing to develop around 41 units across 5 stories, replace that car park but lower the numbers. This again is major activity centre, and interestingly only have one space for car space for the residential use, so effectively really no car parking for the affordable housing component, and also some other amenity. This will depend on state government funding, co-contributing to the funding of the development, but you know, the land would be a reasonable contribution towards the cost. So just finally, what are some of the challenges I see in councils using the planning system or utilising their land? Really, the big one in all of this is that we really still lack sufficient and regular rounds of federal and or state government funding. It's definitely, you know, even with a $5 billion investment that we currently have in Victoria from the state government, it's still not going to meet the unmet or future need. Local governments ultimately have limited financial capacity in particular, and also powers. you know, they are, I think the term is the beast of the state. You know, they aren't, they don't have the same clout as other levels of government. There's actually also, interestingly, some views around whether local government should even have a role in this space. I've certainly heard councillors express, well, this is just all the state government responsibility. Why should we do anything? We don't have the powers, we don't have the capacity. And that's certainly true to a degree around the way that they can use the planning system in particular, but I think it's also, you know, not completely true. And I think the other thing we're seeing, certainly in Victoria, is some councils are taking a lot of effort and others are sitting back and perhaps, I think it's fair to say, don't want any affordable housing in their community. And so there is, I think, also an equity issue there about both council resources into this, but also that some developers are now having to contribute where other developers are not. Definitely that lack of systemised approach to planning and is a real issue. And the development sector, not surprisingly, is very resistant to any controls. And you'll hear, you know, it's just another tax, and different views, I think, around how something like a development contribution would actually work, and whether it would hit the landowner and the land price, or whether it actually, you know, is it true or not that it would pass on to the purchasers in the rest of the building. And the other key issue that certainly arises is there is different views within our communities around what is affordable housing, if it's good, and there is stigma, and this can cause problems in the planning process. And my last slide is a good news story. Again, this is in my backyard. This is a project some of you may be familiar with that was developed by a not-for-profit housing organisation that specialises in the homeless space, launch housing, called the Harris Transportable Project, where they were fortunate enough to negotiate a lease with the Roads Authority, where the Roads Authority had been acquiring land over a period of time for an eventual road widening that may or may not ever happen. And so they had all these residential blocks sitting vacant, and so they've been able to agree to a lease where these small, as you can see, it's like a studio kind of form, houses, they are transportable, so they could be taken to another site if the lease concluded, have been built. I think it's around 59 across 6 sites up a main road in the Maribyrnong local government area. So really great example of innovation, use of government land on a lease, and also contributions from philanthropic and state government and the not-for-profit agency to deliver a housing response that's specifically targeting people, I believe, if not the majority of people who have lived experience or are at risk of homelessness.
Great.
Hopefully I didn't go over too long there. Thanks.
No, that was pretty spot on. Thanks so much, Kate. I'm going to hand straight over to Fiona and keep the conversation going, but please feel free to add any questions that you have into the chat, and we'll come back to all the speakers at the end.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. I'm just going to have a go at sharing a screen.
Sure.
How's that?
Yep, looks good to go.
Okay. So I think we were asked to explore a little bit about housing homelessness and women in Queensland, and my approach is going to be to present some information about need, but then also explore a broader housing framework that QShelter is working on at all times to have a kind of comprehensive and holistic approach to the things that can make a difference, not just to having housing, but to the sustainability of that housing. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where we are and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I love to acknowledge this painting. We're doing some work with Uncle Gerard Bargo at the moment. This is one of his artworks. We're working with him to engage other social housing tenants in an art exhibition as part of Homelessness Week coming up. Gerard, in fact, has been on the hustings today, you know, whipping up interest in submitting artworks. We're really looking forward to the opportunity to celebrate with him when August rolls around. But his artwork is stunning, and we're very fortunate that we have some of it here to remind us all the time about about the opportunities and amazing things that happen for people when they in fact have good housing. It's a launch pad for all sorts of wonderful initiatives and innovations, including Gerard's work to lead other social housing tenants in their enjoyment of art. Just a few assumptions, I suppose, you know, when we are engaged with the housing and homelessness sector in Queensland. You know, we hear very often people talk about the importance of housing first as a model, the idea that people need a house as a foundation for other types of wellbeing domains and making progress in terms of those domains. There might be many different things that people want to work on, from their physical health to their mental health, to employment opportunities, to forging more community connections and social relationships. But we've moved along in our thinking about people needing to, as a mandatory thing, go through temporary or crisis housing on a pathway to something more permanent. It's perhaps been a far more structural reason why we've had those kinds of pathways, because we quite simply haven't had enough housing supply to guarantee people a home first as a basis for all sorts of other things that they might want to work on. So with our sector, we're much more inclined these days to be focused on housing first and making sure that there's enough housing supply to give people an opportunity to move into a permanent home, rather than move through endless points of succession where in fact their lives are destabilised, and it's very costly. Combined with that is just a commitment to prevention rather than crisis-driven approaches. So prevention means that we'd be working with people in tenancies that they have to prevent those tenancies from ending for any reason at all. And then if something does happen that causes homelessness, then it's really, really important that we reduce the time people spend homeless. And that's why, as a companion to housing first, rapid rehousing is really important. We know the longer people spend homeless, the more impact that has on them, and the longer it seems to be that, and further away are the opportunities to really bed down permanent housing solutions. And a framework that helps me think about all of the different types of interventions that can secure housing solutions for people, including women, is Ken Craybill, a doctor from America, who articulated a framework called First Home, Second Home and Third Home, with first home being everything about ourselves that we need to work on and be healthy about in order to feel confident and at one with our opportunities and our futures. Second home is the bricks and mortar, the place in which we live, and third home is the broader community of belonging. So the things that QShelter propose around a holistic framework to achieve housing results and reduced homelessness for everyone, including women, really does span those three things. It's really, really important that people have enough support to sustain themselves and work on their wellbeing. It's really, really important that that's underpinned by a guaranteed home, a place to live that is affordable and appropriate for you. And third home being that broader community of belonging, where the broader community is also accepting and embracing of those solutions, and where people have connections to that broader community as a place to call home. I suppose to give it a pointy end, the reason why we might want to give a real focus to a whole range of solutions, including the planning and local government solution that Kate so comprehensively talked about, and it was a great presentation, is that when you look across most of the comparable environments in the world, there's a persistent relationship between a lack of housing and excess mortality. I think we've got to be much more pointy end about that. Every single day we can't find a housing solution for someone, we're possibly contributing to life-limiting factors that are unremitting. Sometimes people have pushed back at me to say, well, those studies are perhaps not comparable with Australia, but there has just been an Australian study published, which I'd encourage you all to look at, which absolutely is consistent with that. It looked at people over 15 years and showed that, in fact, homeless people do have a higher mortality rate. They have a younger median age at death, and deaths of younger people relate more to things like substance use and risk-taking behaviours, which can be underscored by earlier life traumas. And in older people, it relates more to disease, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, lung diseases. Earlier health interventions could have mitigated those impacts, and of course, the point being that housing as a precursor to better health is absolutely vital. It's certainly one of the social determinants of health. So in all of our advocacy, the most important compass and anchor, or cornerstone for me, is that as long as we don't solve it, people are exposed to factors that reduce the length of their lives. So to focus a little bit on women, and I'm going to just briefly touch on need as a basis for what I want to say about a holistic framework around how we end homelessness and sustain housing solutions. We know that homelessness really negatively impacts women. Many of the people who present to homelessness services in Queensland are women. And in 2016 in Queensland, close to 10,000 women were enumerated as homeless, and that included over 2,000 women in a densely populated place like Brisbane, with many forms of housing, but just not enough access to the types of housing that women can benefit from. And the rate of homelessness in Australia is increasing, with the majority being attributed to younger and older people. And a quarter of homelessness attributed to young people, which equated to 2,500 young women in Queensland. So the idea that it's growing in terms of older people and younger people, and that women are so heavily represented in both of those groups, is a really big challenge. And other studies have estimated that 100,000 women in Queensland over the age of 45 are vulnerable to housing-related distress. And it's a situation that is the subject of growing and considerable research. And we know that it's because single older women over a certain age are much overrepresented in terms of being asset poor and vulnerable to experiences of poverty driven by a whole range of factors. It's one of the fastest groups of people, the growing groups of homeless people nationally. And we know, I'm sure there's very good literacy in this group about the causes of homelessness for women. Domestic and family violence is a key cause. Straight out poverty, driven by having no source of income, and crises at key life stages, such as when you're getting older, leaving the workforce, perhaps there's been relationship breakdown. We know that women don't accumulate wealth and assets in the same way as men, not all women anyway. And there can also be other individual factors such as poor mental and physical health, and structurally just a lack of suitable housing, with quite a significant proportion of women experiencing homelessness a little more hidden through ways of trying to make things work out, such as couch surfing, living in cars, staying in motels or with their children. Exiting hospital, state care or prison are also other vulnerabilities for women. So, we know that there's been an interesting kind of 18 months where the world's struggling to come to grips with a health crisis. And everything that we knew about housing and the pressure on groups like women have been exacerbated by the pandemic in some senses. During the pandemic, there was a really concerted effort across Australia to come up with crisis and solutions that kind of place people in a safer environment so that they were not more vulnerable to catching the virus, but also were not causing a public health concerns to exacerbate. But we've seen that post-pandemic, it's even worse for cohorts like women, where private rental vacancies and competition in the private rental market is terrible at the moment. There's a lot of interstate migration and intrastate migration. There's been some benefits to home purchases during COVID, and better availability of credit and low interest rates. But for groups like women, often they don't have the assets and the income to take advantage of those opportunities. They're excluded from those opportunities. There's been rental regulations which have been extended in Queensland, which included better protection for people experiencing domestic and family violence, which has been great. But with the ending of Job Seeker Supplement, there's been, a time of acute need emerging in a very tight rental market. But hopefully too, in terms of the pandemic, a great deal of interest among various stakeholders, including local government and private sector peak bodies, as they start to emerge to address issues shoulder to shoulder with other of the more usual suspects. So in the context of the pandemic, when we look at vacancy rates and what their impact might be on women, we are in a time of almost unprecedented tight vacancy rates in Queensland in some key locations. So you can see that where people before may have been focused on needing social housing, there's now a growing group of people putting downward pressure on a very scarcely available product. So just wanted to paint a little bit of picture about need and a little bit of a portrait of the issues for women before I move forward to talk about a framework of solutions that we're kind of working on. So we're active in the space of doing policy work in terms of election cycles and pre-budget submissions. We're really waiting to hear what happens in the Queensland state budget, quietly hopeful that there will be some growth, opportunities for growth in housing supply. We think the city deals nationally are an opportunity. And as Kate's presentation highlighted, there's an amazing role for local government, and we're working on a kit at the moment to sort of support local government participation in housing and homelessness solutions. QShelter is working specifically with a group focused on housing older women, inclusive of people with lived experience. We'll have a new emerging Queensland Housing Action Plan, and we make contributions to things like the Make Renting Fair campaign. So it's really, really important that we have a holistic view of policy, and we certainly do also work through our national counterparts, because so much of what's important also rests in the policy realm with federal government. But to the point of Kate's presentation and thinking about working so closely with our state government, with aspirations as well to work more with local government, we really hope we can reach beyond the tendency to talk about either or you know, throw the ball to each other saying it's your responsibility. No, it's your responsibility. We can only imagine a future where significant need is addressed by all levels of government, with the private sector and the community housing sector, with a variety of other support services playing so closely together to implement an integrated, holistic national strategy. I think then we would see the kind of traction that we all probably hope for. To the point of the federal government, though, we were involved in some research that talked about the importance of having federal government stimulus funding for additional units of social housing, some funding to renovate existing social housing to address unmet maintenance needs. And in all of this, of course, the convergence with stimulating the building, maintenance and construction industries, that particular proposal by SGS Economics, which we helped to fund, talked about generating 24,000 full-time equivalent jobs with great contributions to gross domestic product. And the importance of this is not that our rationale is just economic at all, but I think with housing, it's an amazing thing because it does help us find convergence with a range of other interests, and that's always a hopeful thing. So for QShelter, this holistic view is really about capital investment in supply. And, you know, we think that capital investment in supply is absolutely critical. And we think that there is a vital role for public housing, but also with other types of community housing. Community housing providers are in a position to drive down costs. They have very place-based approaches. They are a companion to other forms of housing provision, and they have the capacity to kind of, you know, assist with as many starts as possible in real time, rather than seeing ourselves as being overly invested in one type of housing or the other. Social community housing providers are involved in a range of different types of community housing product, and they are contributing to social and affordable housing, if you remember back to Kate's spectrum. So we think investment in capital is absolutely critical. We also know that it's helpful if the operating costs of community housing providers and social and affordable housing providers are reduced. So there are challenges around the nation about insurance cost, rates costs for community housing providers are high. There's a whole range of ways in which reduced operating costs allows social housing providers to commit more of their revenue to debt financing growth and supply. So the more viable the industry, the more houses they can build and sustain. We certainly are in favour of optimal use of community housing assets and equity to leverage growth. That's an opportunity. We are very committed to working with our government on an improved planning system reforms that support growth and diversity of housing. And we would love to see best use possible of city deals. Enhanced support to sustain tenancies is really important. And I know that this is less to do with the hard infrastructure of housing, but most housing providers in Queensland are really focused on housing people who come from the high and very high parts of the housing register, which means that they become very quickly focused on where is the support coming from. And support to sustain tenancies is critical to that prevention piece. Once people are housed, not everyone needs support, but some people really, really do need support to sustain their tenancies. If you see increased investment in supply and support, then how can we work with the workforce to make sure that we're investing in the skills of the sector to deliver high quality and evidence-based approaches with proven results? We are also of the view that none of this is going to be as good as it can be if we don't start training and supporting people with lived experience of housing need and homelessness. So we are working in the next 6 months to train a group of peer leaders so that they can have direct input to policy and program improvements. And we also know that the system has developed rather than been designed in a perfect form. You know, we haven't all sat down, looked at a piece of blue sky and designed the perfect system in which we deliver housing and homelessness services. So we also favour that service integration resources enable people to navigate the system as effectively as possible, where we do more of the hard work of making the system coherent and easy for people. That's important as well. We support a tenancy sustainment framework which sees diverse housing options. So to go back to Kate's spectrum, we think public, community and private housing systems all need to be healthy. There needs to be good levels of supply. Back in our budget submission, we're really focused on the importance of setting targets around all supply so that the entire housing system's healthy in the equation between supply and demand. Supportive tenancy management, tenant advice and information. It's also critical to get the legislative framework right, which is why we're having input to Residential Tenancy Act reform in Queensland so that people can sustain their tenancies more effectively and there's better responses to domestic and family violence. Specialised support's really important, but I'd put in a big plug as well for connections and service integration. We've seen a variety of moments in the history of Queensland where there's funding for housing and a project. However, communities have come out and organised active community opposition to those projects. So we're also working on resources that actively help our sector and the broader community build support bases for these solutions so that they're not defeated at the point of implementation. Community support is incredibly important. And then there's all sorts of time. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to get over to Brugh when we can. So yeah, if you
no
just
problem. I'll wrap up there. That's really, to say that the framework's really important, that the interlocking parts are really important. And we work with the sector to sort of see those things integrated rather than fragmented.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Brugh, over to you.
Great, thank you. Just give me 2 secs while I share my screen. Great. Can everyone see that? No? Yep, great, lovely. Thanks. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Kaurna people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that may be on the call with us today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Just very quickly before I get into the crux of what I'm going to talk about today, just as a bit of background, I work for an organisation called the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. We're a not-for-profit. We've got offices based in Adelaide and Sydney. We've got 5 key focus areas to all of our work. The purpose of all of that work is to exist so everyone in Australia has a chance to live their best life. Those 5 key areas are the future of home, future of mental health, people-powered solutions, which is all about peer support, regenerative communities, and evolving a social research and development ecosystem in Australia. We've got a consistency to the way that we work. Everything that we do has a very human focus. So that's drawing on a lot of the themes that Fiona's already been talking about, placing lived experience at the center of everything we do. So working alongside and with people who are ultimately trying to get outcomes for. Everything we do is experimental. We've got a strong belief in learning through doing within the context that we're actually trying to, again, create outcomes for. And then also very much with the systemic lens. So not just in isolation of those contexts, but really taking the time to understand what are the intersection parts of different systems that are impacting how and what we're doing. Just a bit more of some shameless self-promotion. What I'm going to speak to you about today is just a small part of our broader work into Australian home and housing systems, which forms the basis of our Future of Home initiative. It's 7 years worth of work, and we've just written a book about it. We've set out a vision of what Australia's home and housing systems could be like. Give me 2 seconds. I'm just going to actually just put the link there. There you go. You can click on there. You can download a free copy of the ebook. And oh, sorry, you can see the wrong thing, can you?
Yeah, can you adjust it?
Going to check in
How do I do
and make
that?
the slides
Does
prominent.
anyone know how I do that?
Maybe, or I don't know.
Try the audience tools tab. You've got it on speaker notes, maybe.
Audience tools.
Up the top next to the speaker notes tab.
You know what? I'm just going to, give me 2 secs. I'm going to get rid of the presenter view and wing it without my notes. Is that better?
We can now just see the report, the PDF.
Oh my gosh, I'm really sorry. Give me 2 seconds. Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Great. All right. Thanks. Sorry about that. Great. But
Excellent.
what I do want to spend a little bit of time doing just before I go into sort of the more specific work that we've been doing around homelessness is spend a little bit of time here. And we, across all of this work, we strongly believe that everyone should have choice and access to a home capable of getting them ahead in life. We're very specific about the word home. We feel that we need to let go of this idea of housing as the fundamental outcome to what we're fundamentally trying to get for people. We really think we need to become more nuanced beyond our current preoccupations with supply and affordability. We absolutely agree they are issues and we need to be looking at our supply and affordability, but we think there's also a big opportunity in Australia to pay greater attention in relation to how people access their home and the conditions we're expecting them to live under. So we've developed, what we call this model for home that exists under 3 critical functions. It has lots of similarities with what Fiona has just been talking about as well. The first one is all about agency. So agency is about how we have control over where we're living. It's not just about the physical spaces that we have control over, but it's also about the circumstances under which we are accessing our home. So making sure that we have control over the tenancy, how long we move there, but also the conditions under which we may move somewhere or we may choose to stay where we are. When you have control over these aspects, you really have the freedom to be able to invest in yourself, in your life, but also your community, which really sets you up to that idea of a home that enables you to progress in life. Connection is all about how does our home connect us to the people that live around us? It's our family, it's our friends, it's how our formal and informal supports interact so that we can get the best outcomes in life. that has as much to do with having the space and the opportunity to have people to socialize within our home, but it's also about how are our neighborhoods operating and what's the structure of our neighborhood that enables supports and information to flow around them. Identity is all about how we express our identities through our home. So that's very critical about the expression of who we've been in the past to who we are today, but also who we might become into the future. So, do we have control over the space to make the walls the colors we want, to hang the stuff on the walls that we want? Do we have the space to interact with the people that define who we are as well? So you can see that there's a lot of interaction between the three of them. Wherever we exist within the housing system or the housing continuum, if you want to call it that, whether it's social, market, something else, we really think that these are the three critical functions that we should be enabling for anyone who's going to be living in what we're working on. So what's the relevance to homelessness? So I guess I just want to first of all say that what I'm going to present to you today is very much quite in the South Australian context. I'm working, I'm based in Adelaide, although I do work nationally as well. The next couple of slides are very much going to be like a human perspective. They might be a little bit critical or sound a little bit critical of certain parts of the system, but that's not our intention. We totally understand there's lots of good work being done in these areas, but we wanted to basically give you a bit of context in some of the challenges, and they're systemic problems. We recognize that, that we're trying to respond to in relation to a specific piece of work that we've actually been doing. So we hear time and time again that keeping a home after being homelessness is often actually more difficult than accessing a house while you're homeless. And what we mean by that is the step out of homelessness is often quite a big step that makes maintaining that new home quite difficult for people for the long term. I'm sure I'm telling you lots of things that everyone on this call actually already knows, but what I'm talking about is things like unexpected bills coming in, having people over when the circumstances at which you've been given a home say that you can't really have people over, people get kicked out. There are lots of different parts of our homelessness and transitional housing and crisis accommodation that actually makes it quite difficult for people to maintain the homes that they get given as they step out of homelessness. And again, staying hopeful without a home is increasingly difficult for people. And what we've really heard is it's impossible to be able to invest in yourself for a better life when you're homeless. So really what we're working towards is giving people the space for this self-investment as a means to setting them up for success for the future. The other thing that we tend to be noticing, we hear time and time again from people we've been working with who have experienced homelessness for a long time, is a lot of our homeless systems organize themselves as if homelessness is the root cause to all the complexity that people are experiencing. Whether that, complexity, I mean like physical health, addiction, social disadvantage, the list goes on and on and on. But we actually all know that homelessness is both a symptom and a cause. And when we sort of reduce things to being a little bit more simple than they actually are in reality, it's not that surprising that, particularly when we're talking in sort of the context of transitional accommodation, and we know it's not all like this, and I'm overgeneralizing here, and I acknowledge that. But in many of these circumstances, we're warehousing people, so we have lots of people living pretty much on top of each other, and through that warehousing function, we're essentially really concentrating complexity and disadvantage. And we've heard time and time again that this is a real problem, because if you go into one of these situations without, say, like a big degree of complexity or disadvantage in your life, then it's highly likely that you're going to catch or acquire some of this disadvantage while you're in there. So I've heard time and time again from people that they come out of these concentrated warehouse kinds of situations with a lot more issues and complexity than when they actually entered. So what we're actually seeing here is that many responses to homelessness make it more difficult for people to break their cycle because they exacerbate the experience of complexity that they were originally experiencing. There we go. So this is just a little bit of an overview of basically what we're trying to respond to in the work that I've been doing with a homeless man here in South Australia. So I also want to recognise that this sounds, you know, can sound quite like optimistic and high level, but hopefully you'll sort of see how we've been translating this into action in the next few slides that I go through. So first of all, we absolutely believe that we need to be investing in people and the conditions that are capable of enabling that success. So what does this mean? So it doesn't matter what channel, pathway, outcome that we're working in or working towards, we really think that we need to be looking at how do we deliver those three critical functions of home for people. Especially jumping out of transitional accommodation, you know, how can we enable that step back into a home to be less of such a big jump compared to the lives that people have been living often for quite a long time. We really think we need to be looking at ways to really deconcentrate or spread out that complexity and disadvantage, which is currently being concentrated in a lot of these different situations. And through doing that, giving people the space and security to feel safe where they live, to feel secure where they live so that they can really invest in themselves and reclaim that hope that I was talking about previously, and fundamentally support people to remain in control of their lives without having their lives controlled by others. And again, that's another challenge that we really hear from people who have spent a long time being homeless and often lived in some of these environments. Oops, there we go. So what I've been working on with Darren, so you can see a photo of Darren there, is a piece of work that we've called Homes More. Fundamentally, what we're looking to do is provide people with a home, create some conditions for mateship, community and support, give them some skill building in some actual physical interactions in how this whole initiative might work. And, you know, fundamentally supporting people to remain in control of their lives through the conditions in relation to how this happens. Just as a bit of background, I initially met Darren with some work that we were doing for the Housing Authority here in South Australia as part of the housing strategy that was implemented at the beginning of last year now. You know, to be perfectly frank and honest, Darren called bullshit on a lot of stuff that was happening. And, you know, we acknowledged that, but we also had we sort of blent into that tension and had a conversation around some of the constraints that we all work around. And we started to get to know Darren a bit better over a couple of weeks and months, and we realized that he really had this really good idea. So this is essentially Darren's idea. This is an example of what, you know, how we really try and work alongside people as much as possible. For the last 18 months, Darren and I have basically turned his idea into an actual proposition, and we've been shopping and pitching it around to a number of different people who we think have potential to partner in creating this outcome. So I'll let you know what that is, and probably have some questions afterwards. Great. So fundamentally, you know, there's nothing actually remarkably innovative here. Like what we're trying to create, the outcome that we're trying to create is essentially a village of small homes that are built and governed by the people who live there. So we're looking at about 4 to 8 homes per site as a means to that deconcentration. There's some common shared spaces. So we're looking at things like guest accommodation, just general social space and storage, which forces, not forces, but facilitates, sorry, you know, the developing of relationship and peer support and relationships between people. We're working towards shared utilities and also, you know, fundamentally that it's self-governed and maintained by people. So it's not ironic, I guess, that one of our hosts today is Co-Housing Australia. This is, you know, very much got a lot of similarities to a co-housing model. Like I said, the outcome itself is not necessarily the new or the innovative part. What we're trying to do is work through and get all the bits of the pieces of the puzzle that we can turn into a business model and a service model, so this actually can become self-sustainable in and of itself. So just really quickly, all of the homes are based on smaller living. We're currently working with a plot of around 80 square meters per plot. We're looking at a shipping container build just as starters, although we're not completely locked on that. There's just, you know, some key sort of advantages in terms of ease in relation to how this could happen from a construction perspective that might help from a shipping container, but it's not wedded to that completely, and there could be other opportunities through other building mechanisms as well. fundamentally designed and built by the individuals, built for sustainable living, not just because it's good for the environment, but it's part of reducing that step out of homelessness and reducing the impact of utilities. Wanting to give people their own private space as much as possible as well, so private bathroom, and it coming furnished. Again, we hear like having to set up a home, stepping out of homelessness is often a big barrier to maintaining that home for the long term. So we're really trying to reduce those barriers as early as possible. You can see we've got some build cost estimates there at around 40 to 80K. And fundamentally, we're wanting to look at a business model that actually enables home ownership, key to having these people remain in control of their existence and the control over the circumstances in which they're living. Just very quickly, the process that we're looking at doing, and this really relies on finding the right partner who has a separate facility. We're cautiously optimistic that we can find the right person, actually. But basically, with the partner, you design and build your own home and you'd register as an employee. The reason for that is that the people that will be living together in each of their villages will be building each other's house. So basically, it's a sweat equity model, which reduces the cost of the build, but also is key in developing the relationships between people as early as possible towards developing that governance model that they're going to need to work out together to make sure that they can live together for a long time. We estimate that will probably, if we have 3 to 5 people working together to construct each other's homes, it's about 300 to 400 hours. So it's similar to many courses that people are made to do as part of, mutual contributions. It's about 3 to 4 months. Once all of that happens, then it essentially gets transferred to the site and move in. So like I mentioned before, we're currently working with a number of people to try and get the right partners around the board. We've had some good early discussions with people who have, committed in principle to do the further design work that needs to happen, I guess is what I'm saying. I'm not going to mention their names because it's probably unfair for me to associate their organizations and brands with this because it's too early on. We're just not there yet. But we've got some commitments to do some of this design work for the business and service model. The key biggest barrier, I guess, that we've currently got is we're looking at how can land flow through this, because how land flows through it will have a big impact on what the service model and the business model is. That's sort of the key barrier. So if we can unlock that, and I've got a few leads, we're making progress. I'll be honest, it's slow progress, but it is progress. We've basically got, we do have someone who's a lender who's willing to potentially lend under this, for home ownership under this model. We've got a not-for-profit who's interested in providing wraparound supports, and some early conversations with people who are used to sweat equity models of building, although they don't necessarily have the resources in and around like a separate centralized facility that would need to happen for that. But like I said, we're still meeting towards, looking for who that could be. And then, there's going to be planning implications. Again, we don't want to do too much of that work too deeply until we've got some land, because that's greatly going to be influenced by where that land is, essentially. So that's it in a nutshell. Thanks for listening. And I'll hand over back to Elena.
No worries. Thanks so much for that. So there's been a couple of questions coming through in the chat, and I think some of the early ones were a little bit around that broader policy setting, I suppose, and getting communities and council areas on board and having support from councillors and the local community rather than pushback when some of these projects hit the ground. I don't know, Kate or Fiona, if one of you wants to pick up on this and where you think the best levers are, I suppose, to demystifying some of the issues that seem to be associated with this model and getting that broad support.
Happy to comment. I think it is really difficult because we've had such a lack of supply. We don't have good ongoing supply of social housing. And so then when developments are proposed, they're really, we may as well put a big flashing light on this on the site saying, you know, housing for poor people, put your objections. In fact, at my local council, if I want to submit to a planning application, I email objections at council name. Like, I can't even write to say I support a proposition without, you know, so we're in this conflict space. And I think there's many levels that it's got to come through. We need councillors to step up in this space, I think, and you know, shut down those conversations that are actually stigmatizing a particular group of people. That's, you know, a good example of that. I think there was a council in fact, the Darebin Council example I showed did a community survey about the leasing of that land before they'd made the decision, and about getting community views on whether they should do that. And they, in that process, firstly collected a lot of information which highlighted that the majority of people that responded were homeowners. The majority of people that didn't want to see that development were homeowners and were older. I'm going to say male, but that might be also in another survey, but they were basically a particular demographic in our community that's not representative necessarily of all of the people, and is certainly not the voice of the people that require this form of housing. So I think council needs to take on, where are those other voices, you know, listening to the service sector, the housing agencies around demand. But also, interestingly, obviously they got a lot of comments in that process about, we don't want these type of people living here, it's going to reduce rates, and that the council officers and in turn council were very clear and said, and basically just drew a line and said, we're a council that respects human rights, we believe in the right to housing. These are not, you know, basically we're not going to get into a discussion about that. That's you know, kind of not in line with those values that we hold. We're happy to talk about how many car parks should go on, what the overshadowing is. These are legitimate planning concerns. So I think we need better communication and discussion and leadership around it, but we also need more supply. And unfortunately, because of where we're at right now, I'm probably on the side of we probably need to have, as they're doing in Victoria, some pretty clear planning rules around affordable housing that take out some of these objections that basically just add more time and money, and the development gets approved anyway. So it's a long-winded response. And we need advocates in our community. I think that's the other thing. Like, so all of us have a responsibility or an opportunity, you know, when these developments are proposed, to be that voice of support for the people who can't otherwise put that voice in.
If I could just add a couple of things, I think those comments are really important. I do reckon this is a long game, and I do think it goes to the heart of how we build a mandate for social and affordable housing in the community. And that requires citizens to be connected to the issue, to be literate about the issues and the solutions, not just problem statements, but good solutions. And then in really practical ways, be prepared to embrace those solutions. I've seen even supporters wobble about design and location and siting, and certainly building height. So I think as a community, it's easy to kind of put out there that these are other people who are objecting, whereas I think we need to move more to a sense of our own community and responsibility, that we all actually need to embrace the solutions, and that sometimes that will take us beyond our comfort zone about the built environment and the way communities are planned and the way communities look. I think communities should look wonderful, and urban and building design should be exemplary, but we all really need to face a future where we're consolidating patterns of development, where we embrace different types of density. That's one thing. When the Queensland government located homeless people in a student accommodation building at Toowong, there was quite organised opposition against it. And this was even in the context of a global pandemic. So I don't know what anybody expected us all to do except accommodate people for everyone's safety, but it was still a rocky road. And in a situation like that, when I was in that building talking to one young homeless man, he was actually a trained chef, and he was looking at the beautiful performance kitchen in the bottom of this building, saying, the first thing he said to me was, the community doesn't love us. he said, but they could. And he was envisioning running cooking classes for the people living there, but also embracing the broader community to come to that. So this idea that we create interesting zones, not planning zones, but just community spaces in which our lives intersect. That's why it's a long game. I think we've got to slowly build up the relationships, the direct relationships we have with people who have lived experience, so that we are coming from the place of a relationship and not just from the place of making and implementing public policy. I think that's really important. I do believe we need community champions as well, and investing in the strength of people with lived experience to tell their story and to influence policy and program development, and therefore investment is really, really important, because I agree with Kate, they are the missing voice. To that end, anyone interested, just keep an eye on QShelter Live, where our events are listed, because in the second half of the year, we've got a piece of training on building community support for social and affordable housing for anybody who's interested. Long game, I reckon, but probably the most important thing we can do.
Yep. Brugh, there's a question here around the critical functions that you mentioned, I think, in your presentation, and also one from Jasmine around the issues of warehousing and where does that research come from?
Yeah, I mean, so the research, I guess, is our work. So we, I can talk a little bit more about the background to our work. So we've been working in, across the nation in many different contexts, ranging from federal to state policy in housing, as well as a number of not-for-profits and market providers in the home and housing space. And so the warehousing is basically something that we've heard from many people who are living homeless, particularly in South Australia. It is, I think I can't see it now, but I saw something around anecdotal. I guess it is technically anecdotal evidence, but it is coming directly from people who are living homeless and living and cycling through these many transitional accommodation kind of perspective, particularly boarding house kind of arrangements. Like I said, I don't wish to be righteous about this. We've got lots of systemic problems, but like I mentioned, we very much take a human-centered approach to everything that we do. And what I'm presenting here is the perspective of the people who are cycling in and out of these places, often for quite a long time. And sorry, Elena, what was the other question? You're on mute.
Critical functions.
Cool. Oh, so what about them?
Where did they come from, or how are they developed?
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah. So I mean, so our home and housing work has a background in an aging space. So we originally got a big philanthropic grant to do 3 years worth of discovery work that was focused around what's the next range of innovation that's going to be necessary for Australia's baby boomers to age well. I didn't do a lot of this work myself personally, but it was sort of tying up just as I joined TACSI. But a lot of my colleagues literally spent time in people's homes all over Australia, finding out, what's it going to take, and to, basically sum that all up very quickly. The two key things that came out of that were to live and age well, you need access to a good home, and that home is becoming increasingly difficult for people as you're getting older to access and maintain. But also how you live later in life has been directly affected by how you live later in life is being directly affected by how you live earlier in life. And that got us to sort of ask, well, what does a home actually mean? And we did a lot more further work basically looking at that. And that framework has sort of formed the key basis for our home and housing work sort of for the last 4 years. And since then we've used it, I'd say probably between 25 and 30 projects that have really formed that core of that future of homework. We've been, to be completely honest, we've taken a very critical lens. Although although we've come out with, we've taken a very critical lens, and it's taken, every time we use it, we go through a validation process to basically, you know, like, what does it mean for the people that we're engaging with at any given point in time? And if it is relevant, if it's not relevant, fine. If it is relevant, what does that actually mean for you? And the sort of the high level 3 critical functions are basically the consistencies that we seem to get time and time again. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. And last night we sort of started setting the scene around how sort of over large a lot of our houses are, and that they are it means that they're incredibly expensive and end up being a large part of our labor and financial indebtedness, I suppose, and that there are solutions that are coming from the affordable housing space, certainly looking at tiny houses and alternative forms of dwellings, I suppose. And we've noticed, especially even in our area, some pushback from communities saying, oh, well, you know, if we're going to create solutions for people, then they need to be real homes, or they need to kind of look and feel like everything else that's on the market. But there is also a large group of people who feel like what we're providing in the sort of normal housing market isn't really necessarily what we should be shooting for and what the vast majority of people actually want, because it's sort of supply driven rather than demand driven. How do you think we sort of get better interaction between people working specifically in the affordability space, but then also people just looking for alternative models of housing, and I suppose to normalize that much broader range of what we see as acceptable housing solutions in both the private and affordable housing sector? Anyone can jump in.
I'll give some really quick 2 cents on that. So I think the housing continuum has a lot to answer for. I get what it is, I get why we use it, but I think it's dangerous in using it as a framework for what could be, just because what is now. And I think throughout, one of the things that we talk about a lot is that we really need to be stimulating greater diversity throughout all of our systems. And I don't just mean in relation to dwelling type, I mean in relation to access and everything that basically impacts how we live. And I think key to that is, you know, we need to have greater conversations more broadly in society around, you know, we've got this love affair with home ownership. Home ownership is not the best thing for everyone in every circumstance. Many cases of home ownership really hold people back, and people are quite disadvantaged by their experience of home ownership. And I think once we can sort of let go of a lot of these sort of really implicit assumed norms, and it's really related obviously to our culture in the quarter-acre block, and, you know, mowing the grass on the weekends and having a barbie, you know, all of that, it really gives us the space to go, well, if it's not just home ownership, what else could it be? And really sort of almost blow up the continuum from like something that's linear to something that's, you know, it's a lot more. I know I use the word system a lot, but systemic, sorry, that's my bias.
Yeah, jump in. I think also the role of governments here. So an interesting example is the Victorian government's recently released 3 large public housing sites that were desperately in need of redevelopment, very old, poor quality walk-ups. And instead of selling that land to the private sector, which is an approach they're doing on some other sites, they're actually leasing that land to a consortium led by a not-for-profit housing agency, private investment, private developer building. But the outcome of that means that the government will continue to own the land, and the housing will be build to rent, both a combination of dedicated social and affordable rentals for people on particular incomes that meet the government eligibility, and market price rent. And so really helping to establish new tenures like long-term rental, which are far more common in European cities, and giving that stability of tenure, which is really, you know, what home ownership provides us, as long as you can pay your mortgage, and also greater ability to kind of, I guess, claim that place as your home. So I think there's real opportunities. There's a huge amount of government land that launch housing projects. Another example where, you know, a different housing response than would, you know, these are standard blocks which would normally have one house or maybe 3 townhouses, can fit a different housing response that's a good quality. And so how we, back to that point I think Fiona made, like the discussion around density, and that we need, you know, our choices are to keep sprawling or to accommodate more diverse housing, which does mean we need to kind of maximize the land that we have, and that does mean smaller forms of housing, and that's not such a scary thing, and that can be appropriate and things that people actually want. So I think we need more of those voices, particularly from renters, and I think, and people who are maybe aspire to home ownership or maybe don't, but having those voices in our planning discussions, because really it is just driven by people who've already gotten into the market and are predominantly homeowners, maybe investors. So I think and maybe some of that view then has a kind of perception of the type of housing that people need as opposed to what people actually want.
Yeah, and I suppose it also ties into having a better conversation about people wanting to right size and downsize rather than stay in sort of large houses, and that if there are more people who are doing that, then that sort of helps normalize that scale of dwelling, and it means that there might be more demand in higher density areas. But they're also it's then makes it more necessary to have those high functioning shared facilities and amenities, so that people don't feel like they are losing out on some of those lifestyle opportunities by reducing their individual housing footprint. Karen has a note. Oh, Fiona, did you?
I was going to say that I think we need as many options as reflects all of our diversity. Like I've been, you know, watching with interest build to rent projects in Brisbane, which will be large accommodation blocks in one of the places I love the most, Fortitude Valley. And I think when I, you know, in a few years' time, that would suit me down to the ground, to be honest. But it's not for everyone. And I guess the point is we need to, if we're in the business of supporting a framework, it's not helpful to get into binary propositions about what's better or worse. What's really helpful is that we say we need a framework in which all of these options are encouraged and supported. Smaller homes are a great idea. We really support the missing middle and gentle infill development in terms of favourable, our submission talks about favourable conditions for more secondary dwellings accessible to more kinds of people, not just family members. There's all sorts of things we have to do, and we need it all to advance. So not so much energy on is this right or that. It's more, here's a framework and here are all the things we need to house all of us, and we're all different, you know. And density for some people will be really great for community housing providers. Yield is really important to the sustainability of developments, and that can be done really well in terms of design, location, all of that. So I just encourage us all to kind of love it all for at least 5 minutes to allow as many different possibilities to flourish.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a comment from Karen around how securing finance for construction can be really challenging, especially when you're looking for greater innovation in housing. Have any of you come across good examples of partnerships between sort of private individuals wanting to do more innovative things and working with community housing providers or other organisations?
Are you asking me, Elena, or everyone?
Everyone. Oh, but you're welcome to chip in to elaborate.
Oh no, so yeah, that point was really saying that a big part that I think is missing in these conversations is looking at advocacy and almost lobbying to change how construction is financed, because often that system is a massive stop to anything which is innovative in design, innovative in topology, or innovative in tenure and ownership models, because of the way construction finance is assessed. It is really under the banner of APRA, and APRA, which is the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, basically says unless you can prove that something like this has been sold on the market at the price you're going to sell it for, and show me existing examples of that, we can't with any certainty say that what you build and what we lend to will be a good deal for this bank. And so you get stuck in this, we just keep cookie cuttering, and it's very difficult to innovate. So alternative buckets of money for finance, for innovation in those sort of four main areas: design, topology, ownership structures, and resident management structures is what's really necessary. I think there's heaps of great ideas out there, but putting them on the ground is the hard part, and construction is normally the main gateway to that.
Mike, have you got your hand up?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Elena. On the on the finance front, there's a financing paradigm called BOT agreements, or build, operate, transfer agreements. Now, I'm not sure whether there's been a discussion around this or not already, but this is something that I've come across recently, working with one of our advisors who's a pretty much a global expert in these arrangements. And they're fantastic arrangements to both create infrastructure and give investors a return, but also to build long-term community wealth. So I think in the affordable housing space, this could be really interesting to have a look at. And these agreements are used in like big infrastructure projects, like building bridges or tunnels or roads, where an investor will come in and build and then operate the asset for a period of time, generally somewhere between 30 and 50 years, and then transfer the ownership of that asset over to the government or to the community. So I'm really actually interested in exploring this model for social housing and for housing in general, so in this case, where you're talking about the land being owned by the government and then leased as an affordable housing site, and it still stays owned by the government. In this case, investors could come in, they could buy the land would sit in a trust and develop it for the whatever housing model it's being developed for, and then and operate that. They would get the benefit of the financial benefits of owning and operating that site for 30 years, but each year 3% of the ownership would pass over to the local community. However you define that, it could be a not-for-profit organisation, it could be a geographic organisation, it could be given back to the government. So then after 30 years, the whole site is then owned by the community, and the community would reap the benefits from that. So it's a little bit like, I guess it sounds a little bit like a rent-to-buy scheme as well. But I don't know if anyone's heard of these BOT agreements, build, operate, transfer agreements, being used in housing in Australia.
Jasmine Palmer's just noted that it sort of sounds basically what Assemble Housing in Melbourne is sort of using. But maybe it's also something that would tie in a little bit more as a hybrid to community land trusts, and is potentially more accessible to getting access to council land if you can use a lease agreement as well, and separate the housing from the land. There's another comment in the chat, but I think we've come to time, so I don't want to go too far over. These sound like some conversations that would be great to continue in the Friday session. So I would definitely encourage everyone to come along to that, and maybe we can thrash these ideas out a little bit more, given that we haven't solved homelessness today. I know everyone's disappointed. So thanks so much for coming along. These recordings, if I haven't completely ruined it, will be available on the NENA website. And we'll see you all we have another session this evening. So hopefully we can see you all again there. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, and we will try and also make their slides available as soon as possible. Thanks everyone so much.